Well, welcome. My name's Matt Gray. I just want to acknowledge to start with the traditional custodians of the land on which we're meeting, the Windermere country, and really also acknowledge the fact that there's lived experience in the room and out there as we're broadcasting. I really want to acknowledge the fact that there will be people who have their own experience. It might be depression or anxiety or other mental illnesses, and there'll be people who have family members, friends, people who they know who have had some experience of that. And also I am going to speak about suicide as well, and I know there's lived experience of that. The reason why we talk about it is a little bit like being a senior first aid person, someone who works in the physical first aid space, talking about CPR. The life-saving part of this is talking about suicide openly. So I will be doing that and asking you to engage with some of the things that are life-affirming in that as we talk. You'll notice the PowerPoint that I'll be showing. Hold the ladder is the term, or holding the ladder is the term I use. And the reason I use that expression is because for many people, they don't, in a crisis situation, they don't know what to do. And so often with friends, they might fall into their friend's crisis. They might come to a point where they're kind of rushing around trying to get something happening for their friend to save them or to make them, put them in a better place. I think one of the things to keep in mind is the calmer we are in that, the better off we are. And I think sometimes because people go to that friend and fall into the crisis of the friend, sometimes that helps that friend, makes them feel less alone. But what it often does is also affects us afterwards. So I'm going to talk a little bit about how we can help our friends. And one of the images I want you to hold on to, and it's the one I use with staff as well in schools, that's the idea of holding the ladder, is keeping everything calm and still so so that that person can right themselves, so they can actually get themselves under control and work it from there. That's the best outcome. I'll tell you a little bit about why, how come I'm here, what's my role here. Well, after being in schools for many years, for about 25 years, I volunteered for Lifeline. And finished off my counselling studies at UTAS. And while I was doing that, I got a real love for working on the phones at Lifeline. And as time went by, eventually became the manager of the community education arm of Lifeline here in Tasmania. And about 3 or 4 years ago, I started my own business communicating about mental health. And I also work for Mental Health First Aid these days. I'm a national trainer, so I train instructors who then go out and train people like yourselves in first aid, in mental health first aid. So that's kind of a big part of what I do now. Mental health first aid has the aim of equipping people, just average person in the street, with the same skills you get in physical first aid. Who's done their physical first aid here? A few people? Yeah. Physical first aid is a bit different in that most people say when they do physical first aid, they don't tend to use it a lot, but it's there if they need it. With mental health first aid, it's one of those things you're much more likely to use on a regular basis. So what we want to do mainly to start with is just look at some of the myths around mental health and around mental illness in particular. What are some of the myths that we tend to see a lot of, just in terms of the first myth, that nothing can help. A lot of people don't make the connection between physical illness and mental illness. That just as with physical illness, if we are unwell in our physical being, we can get that checked. We go to our GP, our doctor, and find out, is there something wrong, blood tests, all that sort of thing. I think a lot of people think that mental health somehow is a little bit less able to be dealt with in that manner. The reality is there's nothing about mental illness that makes it less recoverable or less manageable. The vast majority of people will have one episode who do experience mental illness, will have one episode of it and will recover. The vast majority. Some of the rest will learn how to cope. Might be anxiety. They struggle with anxiety. They might take some medication, they might see a counsellor, and they learn strategies on how to look after themselves and how to prepare themselves for any task they've got. And they learn to live with it and often live quite comfortably with it. And for a small group of people, some of those conditions might be chronic that they'll need ongoing help to keep going with. But there's nothing about mental illness that means it can't be solved or can't be resolved. Another one is mental health problems destroy your life. I also compare with disability, with physical disability. This is a picture of my friend Shannon on my Facebook. He's one of my favourites. Shannon is one of my ex-students going back some years now, back in Sydney. And Shannon is a great example of someone who overcomes his disability. You can see here that's a very clear picture of him on his paddleboard. That picture of him on a paddleboard is what anyone who goes to his Facebook will see. And it really sums him up. He's not going to miss out on anything. Being in a wheelchair and not having the use of his legs means nothing in terms of, he feels he can do anything. And usually there's things that can happen to make that possible for him, and that he pursues that as much as he can. And that is really important for us to recognise, that if that's true of physical disability, it can also be true of mental disability. That there's nothing about mental disability or mental illness that means that somehow we can't enjoy life or can't experience life just like anyone else. I think that's the message I want to get out there, and a really important one. It's been some really significant characters in history that have been leaders, world leaders, as in Winston Churchill here, the leader of the English people during the Second World War and beyond. Winston Churchill spoke of his black dog. Black dog meaning his word for depression, this dog that follows him around, that appears at the moments when he least needs them. And yet, over time he found that he was able to learn ways of living with his black dog and helping. So there's some good cartoons that have come out of that with the idea of this ever-present dog that sits with us. Some of us who have experienced depression may know what that's like, having this sort of presence in your life, this cloud in your life that follows you around. That is the experience of a lot of people with depression. I'm going to talk a little bit later about that. I'm going to talk a little bit about my own experience and the experience within my family with mental illnesses like depression. And that is, there is a genetic component to mental illness. We haven't nailed that down yet, but we do know that if you live in a family that experiences mental illness, you are more likely to experience mental illness. Doesn't mean you will, just makes it more likely. And there are many protective factors as well, things like good health and physical health and good sleep patterns, all those sorts of things that can also help us and mean that we don't necessarily get that. J.K. Rowling speaks of her experience of depression being the actual catalyst she needed to be able to be successful. That as an unemployed single mum living in a small apartment, that's where the Harry Potter series came out of, that experience. People that we perhaps would look at and say, oh, there's no weakness there. Someone who's really strong like The Rock, we often look at him and think, oh, well, he wouldn't have weaknesses. Clearly, from his point of view, taking his mental health seriously has been an important part of his life. Tom Boyd, an AFL story around mental illness as well. Some of you may be familiar with that. People that we know well who have succeeded in a brilliant way in many ways. Ian Thorpe, world champion swimmer, suffered from probably one of our best ever swimmers. Struggled with depression even while he was training, even while he was being a world champion. He was experiencing his depression. So that important message comes through here. Osher Günsberg, I'm not a great fan of some of the reality stuff that he does, but he speaks very eloquently about his own experience, quite severe experience of mental health, where he's definitely questioned his own sanity and struggled. Some of you might, and all of you have access to iView, and you can't ask that. I don't know whether you've seen that series. And who's seen a few of those episodes? Really worth seeing the one on OCD, because OCD is one of those things that everyone reckons they've got, right? Everyone goes, oh yeah, I've got this tidy thing or whatever. I hear that a lot from certainly some of the people I train. They go, oh yeah, I've got OCD. The reality is that's one of the problems, the stereotypes, that's part of the stigma that comes with mental illness, that people play it down. Actually, OCD at its worst can be a very debilitating illness that often involves intrusive thoughts. So it's not just, I've got to clean, it's I've got to clean or someone will die. I knew a lady once who couldn't come home from a funeral without burning her clothes. She had to come straight home, put all her clothes that she wore to the funeral in a pile and burn them. That she thought that if she didn't do that, someone would die. So those sorts of intrusive thoughts are very much a part of a lot of mental illnesses, and OCD is one of them. So you can see that to say, oh, I'm a bit tidy, therefore I've got OCD, can be actually very hard for those people who have it and for whom it's quite debilitating. Might come in the form of not being able to get out of the house because I'm not sure that I've locked the door, and something terrible is going to happen if I don't lock that door. Just in terms of that, Lady Gaga also, she's actually come up with a group called Born This Way Foundation. And Born This Way Foundation is a mental health charity for young people, and I'll talk a little bit more about her in a few minutes. But Lady Gaga has been quite active in this space because of our own experience growing up of mental illness. Mentally ill people are dangerous. This is a common one, and if you watch the newspaper or read if you're a Netflix person who watches a lot of those thrillers where the person with psychosis, the psychotic killer, is involved, who's most at risk with those sorts of illnesses, those psychotic illnesses? Who's most at risk, do you think? themselves, indeed. The person who has psychosis is very much at risk of suicide and more likely to be the victim of violence than to be the perpetrator. Really important for us to remember. In fact, people who were asked not so long ago, over a calendar year, people who'd been assaulted were asked the various aspects of the person that assaulted them. 60% said that they were all under the influence of alcohol, or that the person that assaulted them was under the influence of alcohol. Less than 10% said it was due to mental illness. So substance use is often gets off the hook, whereas mental illness gets blamed. And the stats don't seem to suggest that's true. So let's have a look at just some measurements, some simple in someone's thoughts, feelings and behaviour that affect their functioning over time. They're the key kind of things that we want to look at. It's, if someone's struggling this week, we wouldn't necessarily assume their mental health is in trouble. But next week, if it's still going, that duration is what we're talking about. And when we're talking about depression, we're only talking about 2 weeks. Keep that in mind. That doesn't have to endure for long before it starts to be quite debilitating, and especially with young people, because of all those developmental tasks that we have, the growing body, the growing brain. It's so important that our mental health is right. Here's some stats around Australians aged 16 to 24 over a calendar year, their experience of the symptoms of mental illness. You can see there how high, for instance, anxiety, that more than one in five young women experience the anxiety to the extent of a disorder. So noting that, and do note the figures are binary because that's where we get our data from in terms of historically, but over time we will also get a picture of the trans community and what those people who don't necessarily identify as male or female. And what we do know already is that mental illness is highly significant in that group in particular, along with Aboriginal people and rural and remote. And in Tassie, where we're actually regional. No one in Tassie is regarded as city as far as the health department's concerned. So we're all just a little bit more at risk than perhaps people on the mainland who live in Melbourne or Sydney, according to that data. So there's 1 in 4 anyway, young people experience a mental health disorder, that they could get help for. So just in terms of that, this is what we call the burden of disease, which means it's what are most likely to affect our young people. So the thing is, in our society, heart problems, cancer, those sorts of things rank very highly across all age groups. But often young people don't experience those. It's a smaller minority of young people that experience that. So these are the main burdens of disease that people experience. Suicide is the #1 killer of young men, and 4th on the list for females. Anxiety is at the top of the list for females, as you noticed there, and still on the list for males. Alcohol use disorders. So that's using to the extent that that's getting in the way of them living their lives and their functioning. So helpful to get just a picture of what are the things that affect people. I'm going to skip that. I'm going to come back to those ones. Just want to come to the main symptoms of depression. What we need to get a diagnosis of depression, you need one of 2 things at the top of the list, and that is that unusual, sad or irritable mood, and that loss of enjoyment and interest in activities. Often that loss of enjoyment, if you think about it, and maybe there's people who are looking at a friend or maybe even thinking about themselves in this, one of the most common things I find with young people is that they frequently stop doing the things that they used to do. They might have, when they were 11 or 12 or 13, had this life that had a bunch of things in them and they were busy, and then slowly, as they've chosen not to be involved with things, it starts to filter down to just a handful of things, and sometimes substance use can be at the centre of that. and that's the way we cope. That's our coping strategy. The more coping strategies you have in life, the more things you do, whether it be music or drama or friendship groups or groups you're involved with actively, school, whatever it might be, the more things you are able to get involved in there, the more you're able to share the where in terms of your coping. What helps you? Going for walks, things like that, mucking around with your pets. One of those two needs to be present for a diagnosis of depression, and 5 overall of those 9. So you can see sleep difficulties. Frequently young people experience that, a loss of interest in food, or perhaps even eating too much, so an unhealthy relationship with food, and that difficulty concentrating. So it doesn't take a lot of things there to make up the 5, and some people may be thinking, oh, I wonder if that's something I need to get some help with. If you're thinking that, the answer is do go and get some help. It may be that you go to your GP and they go, look, I think it's okay, I think we just need to help you with some coping strategies. Or it might be that they need to do more than that, but it's always good to ask the question. And your GP is certainly answering that question with a lot of people. I want to share with you just my own experience, and I'll just turn the PowerPoint off for a moment while I do that. I grew up with a mum who had quite severe depression, quite severe anxiety levels, to the extent that she actually attempted her life a number of times in a 24-hour period. And that was kind of all the impetus we needed to get her help. And we finally got her some help. So she was hospitalised for about 18 months of her life all up, just at various points, not in one big clump, but over her 20 or 30 years of her life. She spent time in hospital to look after her own mental health. And one of the things I used to do, I used to look at her and go, what is wrong with you? Life is so awesome. How come? You're like this, when she'd get down. And she was a beautiful mum. She did all the things that mums do, and we had a really good life at home despite what she'd experienced. And yet I kept looking at her and thinking, why aren't you enjoying this more? Life's awesome. As I was a sporty kid, loved music, and just, had a pretty good life, really. Over time, that became something that I was curious about. And eventually, it wasn't until I hit my 40th birthday that I started to realise what Mum had experienced. I wanted to run a marathon before I was 40. So I did that and got involved in long distance running and really enjoyed it. It was something that really, one of those strategies I talked before, those coping strategies, were really good for me. Put the headphones on, go for a run, and that really fueled me. And I was spending about 10 hours a week running. But after I ran my first marathon, expecting to keep going and travel the world and do some marathons, I had some big plans. Unfortunately, I had a back injury because I'm a rugby figure, right? We're not supposed to run long distances. People who are my shape, and unfortunately, I had to stop running. And all the doctors said it. They said, you'll recover, but you just need to stop doing what you're doing because it is impacting your spine. That sent me into a I was very disappointed at first. It was just devastating for me. And yet, as time went by, that kind of settled like that dark cloud. And I suddenly understood what Mum had experienced. If someone had said to me, get over it, it would have been like saying, grab yourself by the shoelaces and lift yourself in the air. It was physically impossible. I couldn't do that. Now, there were things. I picked up swimming, and I picked up, just spent time with friends and talked them through what was happening for me. Some of them were okay. Some of them didn't quite get it. They just thought I was being a bit soft. But the reality was I had never experienced anything like it up to that time, and I've never experienced, touch wood, anything like it since. That for this 6-month period, I was depressed. And I suffered from anxiety as I faced the idea of sleeping. At times I was measuring my sleep in minutes. For a number of weeks in there, I couldn't get more than a few minutes sleep a night. I wasn't getting even an hour of sleep. And that was having a huge effect on my life and the way I was experiencing it. It was a very dark place, and I'm so glad that I hung in there and just sort of believed the people who were treating me. When I went to see the doctor, he said, "You'll get through this. You just need to hold on to those coping strategies." Doing exercise, eating well, getting a good night's sleep, which I managed to do in the end, getting a sleeping pill off the doctor, and eventually that started to pull me through, and my mental health started to improve. But that really told me that what Mum was experiencing was real, and most people who have that experience I was surprised at just how real mental illness is. And it's not necessarily something you can do by yourself to get over it. Oh, I'll just get over it if I just, forget about it and just, pull my socks up or whatever. That isn't the way often mental health or mental illness works. So just in terms of backing back onto our PowerPoint, there we go. Thank you. Anxiety. Everyone experiences anxiety. Anxiety is something that actually fuels us in many ways. You could call it anxiety, maybe you'd call it stress or pressure or whatever it might be. Sometimes, and I'm in a drama studio, so I reckon there'd be a fair amount of stress in this place at various points, with people trying to learn lines and remember where they're supposed to be in a scene or whatever it might be. All those things where other people are watching you, that's pretty high anxiety. But for most of us, for many of us, that fuels performance. It helps us to be better at what we do and to make sure we nail it. Unfortunately, anxiety at a certain point starts to make an impact for the worse on our performance. So that experience of walking to exam, for instance, and just not being able to, staring at the paper, not being able to respond, that can be where anxiety starts to actually make us less functional, and that's when we walk into the possibility of an anxiety disorder. One of the things I like to train people to do is to think in terms of getting an understanding. One group I follow a lot is SANE Australia. They're on your Instagram or Facebook or whatever you follow, Twitter. SANE is frequently putting out videos of people talking about their mental illness. Might be 45 seconds of someone talking about borderline personality disorder. For most people, we haven't had much to do with that. To hear someone explaining and describing what that's like for them is really helpful. The reason I say for them is to always remember that everyone will experience this a little bit differently. I don't pretend that I understand everyone's depression because I experienced it. I don't pretend to know what it's like to lose someone close to suicide just because I've lost someone in my life. It's important to remember that that experience will vary for everyone, but getting a feel for it and understanding that it's real, I think they're the key things to remember. Just those young people that we looked at before, only less than half of those people were actually getting help. So they declared that they were having these symptoms of mental illness, but only less than a half of them were actually getting help. And then when they were asked why they didn't get help, these were the answers. They felt too embarrassed or shy. They felt that stigma. They felt that blame that people would have on them. And then a number of people said, I don't know. That's a common one. When you're a young person, it's often hard to articulate. And this is one thing I'd really like to encourage you. Thank you. One of the things I'd really like to encourage you to do when it comes to mental illness and talking to friends about their mental health is give them time. No one ever died of awkward. Silence, asking someone about it and keeping silent and letting them think through. I use a lot of silence in the counselling work I do. If I'm talking to a young person, I use a lot of silence in the space. I know it feels awkward, but it's that time to think about what is actually happening for me, because that I don't know is real. For a lot of young people who maybe haven't experienced mental illness before, when they first come across it, it can be quite a shock and quite a difficult experience. So giving them time and space to talk about it. Don't feel like you have to answer or find a solution. The best thing we can do, and what Lifeline do when they answer the phones, the aim is to listen to that person so that person doesn't feel as alone. Because having a mental illness can be one of the most lonely experiences, and having thoughts of suicide even more so. So really important that we basically help that person not to feel alone. If you give cheap advice, just, that kind of throwaway advice that says, oh, just go do some exercise, or, make sure you sleep, or whatever. If we do too much of that, that person will start to feel lonely even in your presence. So listening to them and trying to understand what's going on for them. I often say empathy is a little bit like that curiosity. What's it like being you? That's kind of the kind of thinking that I want people to have when they're helping a friend who's struggling with their mental health. So just I want to give you a quick plug for the various courses that I run, and one that I've done with some of your staff here at Rosny, and we'll look to do in future as well, is the Youth Mental Health First Aid, which is actually for adults who work with young people. That's the design of it. And down the track, if you end up at UTAS or one of those institutions, you'll probably be offered an opportunity to do a mental health first aid course for adults. But as I said, Lady Gaga has a special role with mental health first aid. Mental health first aid is actually an Australian group, but when we wrote a teen course for young people like yourselves, she actually said, I want a piece of that. I want to actually go into schools where there's been violence in the States, and I want to roll out teen mental health first aid. So we helped her to develop a course that she could run with those young people, which is happening as we speak. COVID made a bit of a mess of it for a while, but it's happening as we speak. So that, just to let you know that there are courses that are available for young people. Just I want to really emphasise to you the importance of your own self-care and being deliberate about that. That is one of the best things you can do in terms of making sure your mental health is maintained and not letting your batteries run down. Thinking about what are the different things, what are the things. If today, one of the things that comes out of this for you is, there are a few things that I used to do that I'm not doing anymore, things I used to enjoy that I've stopped doing. That is one of the signs that depression may be there, or it may be a sign simply that our mental health isn't as good as it can be. Remembering that it doesn't necessarily mean that you're mentally ill. It could just mean that you need to look after your mental health better and plan for it. And so that's something I do as well. Oh, that didn't come out right. Do keep in mind, kids' helplines are up for ages up to 24, 25, I believe. So it's, even though it's called Kids Helpline, sounds like it's for 8-year-olds. It's actually for anyone in that group. Lifeline, which is 13, 11, 14, is of course a resource that's always available. And eHeadspace is the one that's missing on there. Chats at eHeadspace is one you can look up, and that's not speaking on the phone, it's using chat, using SMS. All right, friends, we might leave it at that and take questions. Are there questions that people have from what I've spoken about today? Mm-hmm.
Yeah. In the meantime, what do you do if you're a little bit worried about a friend? What's a really good way of really just kind of making that initial first kind of sentence or two?
Yeah, so the question is, what should we do in that first moment with a friend? I generally talk about the idea of approaching a friend and saying, I'm a little bit worried about you, you okay? Are you okay day? We talk about that. Sometimes that lacks the intent. But if I already say straight up front, look, I'm a little bit worried about you, are you okay? We're immediately inviting them into that place where they can tell us that. Try and find a good time to do that when there's not people around and you've got a little bit of spare time to spend as well. But I think the main thing is to listen, to make sure that person feels heard and understood. And sometimes just repeating back little bits of what they say. So you're feeling pretty trapped at the moment. You're feeling like there's not a lot of point. Don't be scared if they say things that sound very despairing, that sound like you're really worried about that they might be having some pretty dark thoughts, just give them back those dark thoughts that it sounds like a really dark space you're in at the moment. Don't feel you need to solve it. Oh, come on, we'll do something. We'll make you feel better. That's not necessarily your responsibility, but being with them. But most importantly, not doing it alone. So if you really feel that your friend is in a dark space and needs help, and I say this really, even if you're worried that your friend is somehow going to, resent you for talking to someone else about it, I really encourage you to talk to an adult, sit with an adult and say, look, I'm a little bit worried about my friend. What do I do here? What should I do? And make contact. Because my experience over time is that even though people might be upset with you in the first instance, over the long haul, people go, thank you so much for doing that. It meant I could get on the road to being well. And that's the way we talk about mental illness, becoming well again. And that's the goal. Yeah. But being a good friend. You don't necessarily gain people, if someone walked through the house with a sore tooth, your friend comes over and they've got a sore tooth, you wouldn't necessarily run to the kitchen and get, some tools and do some amateur dentistry. So don't become their therapist. Try and avoid that space and say, we need to get you help. Who do you think we should talk to? Inviting them into that, because that's one thing we do know about young people. Often they carry their friend's illness for some time before they get help. That's not good for you, it's not good for your friend. Really important that you move together and be a good friend. That's the key.
Any other questions from the audience? We haven't got any in the chat at the moment.
Okay.
Any questions? We will be in the Wellbeing Hub at lunch, so there will be some teachers up in the Wellbeing Hub on level 4 if you're wanting to go up and have a chat, or in the student engagement services area as well downstairs. So that's something to sort of look at as well.
Okay, thank you. Well, just let me reiterate that seeking help is not a weakness, it's a strength. So really, if you've felt from today, you're worried about a friend or yourself, just seek help. That's the most important thing you can do, and that professional help can be really valuable. And sometimes the first time you meet someone, the first time you might see a counsellor or whoever it might be, it can be a little awkward, and sometimes young people go, oh, I'm not doing that again. I really want to encourage you to persevere, because that is also the experience of many people who get good help for their mental health, is that they persevered. Even, moving from one person to another if that person is not comfortable with that person, because eventually you'll find that person who it'll really work well with. So thank you for having me today. I really appreciated coming to talk. Always enjoy coming to Rosny. It was good being here, and all the best. Keep safe.